What would you do if you were falsely accused and stood in court with no one by your side? This is not a fictional story. This is the reality that Korea, a 14-year-old girl, had to face. A child accused of theft and property damage based on a blurry video and vague testimony. Everyone thought she would crumble under the pressure of the legal system, but they were wrong. What no one knew was that Karia was a legal genius. To the shock of everyone in the courtroom, not only did she refute every point made by the prosecutor, but she also had the judge stumped when answering legal questions correctly. The way this young girl turned the case around left everyone in disbelief. What do you think about this case? If you were Karia, what would you do? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you believe knowledge is power and justice needs to be protected, hit like, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Now, let's see what happened in that courtroom. The Tennessee courtroom wasn't cold because of the air conditioning. It was the tension that made the air heavy. Every pair of eyes was locked onto Karia, the 14-year-old girl sitting at the defendant's table. Some looked at her with doubt, others with indifference, and the rest with judgment, as if they had already decided her fate. The orange jumpsuit felt like a weight on her shoulders, a symbol of guilt that had been assigned to her before she even walked through those doors. But Karia didn't lower her head. Her grandfather, Frank, had taught her one thing: no matter what happens, never let them see fear. And she had never forgotten that lesson. At the judge's bench, Judge Kalas adjusted his glasses and let out a weary sigh, flipping through the case files like he was reading something not worth his time. He never once looked at the young girl on trial. The sheriff spoke first, his voice firm and commanding. The state of Tennessee charges Karia with felony theft and property destruction. The words echoed across the silent room. No one laughed. No one gasped, because everyone in that room had already made up their minds. She was guilty. Prosecutor Riss stood up, adjusting his tie, his tone calm but sharp. Your Honor, the evidence is undeniable. Surveillance footage from Davidson and Coe Jewelry captured the defendant near the display case just moments before the alarm went off. Minutes later, the security system was disabled, and a sapphire necklace valued at $12,000 went missing. Additionally, a witness identified the defendant running from the scene. A heavy silence followed. Karia didn't flinch. She had heard these accusations too many times. The same voice, the same certainty, the same smug tone. Her court-appointed attorney, Thomas Lane, stood up, but he didn't even look at her as he spoke. Your Honor, my client is only 14 years old. She has no prior record. Riss cut him off with a smirk. That we know of. Karia's fingers tightened against the fabric of her jumpsuit, but she refused to react. Judge Kalas sighed again, clearly eager to move on. He waved a hand dismissively. Let's not waste time. Does the defense have anything worth arguing, or should we move straight to witness testimony? Lane fumbled with his notes, unprepared for an actual fight. My client wasn't near the store when the theft happened. Riss scoffed. Interesting, because the security footage says otherwise. And for the first time since the trial started, Karia spoke. Show it. The room froze. Judge Kalas raised a brow. Excuse me? Karia turned her head and stared directly at Riss. Play the surveillance footage. A flicker of hesitation crossed Riss's face before he nodded to the bailiff. Minutes later, the courtroom screen lit up. The grainy black and white footage played. Inside the jewelry store, a figure wearing a hoodie approached the display case. Their face was mostly hidden. Karia stared at the image. The height, the build. It could have been her, but only she knew the truth. She waited. The figure in the video reached for the case, and then, pause it. Judge Kalas squinted, but motioned for the video to be stopped. The image froze. Korea tilted her head, her gaze locked onto a detail that no one else had noticed. The curiosity in the room shifted. For the first time, the attention wasn't on her guilt, but on what she saw. Finally, she raised a hand and pointed at the screen. From that moment on, everything began to change. The courtroom screen flickered to life, drawing in every gaze like a magnet. The surveillance footage from Davidson and Coe jewelry began playing, grainy, monochrome, but still clear enough to show a hooded figure approaching the display case. Their face was obscured, but their build and height bore some resemblance to Karia. Prosecutor Riss folded his arms, a smug smile stretching across his face. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the undeniable evidence, the proof that would cement Karia's guilt. "This is your client, isn't it, Attorney Lane?" Riss asked, his voice laced with triumph. Karia didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, examining the screen, as if she were searching for something that no one else had noticed. The figure in the video reached toward the display case. "Pause it." Her voice rang through the courtroom, clear, unwavering. Judge Kalas arched an eyebrow, but gestured for the bailiff to comply. The image froze, capturing the moment the suspect's hand hovered over the glass counter. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Riss asked, half mocking, half curious. Karia ignored him. Instead, she turned her gaze to the jury, then pointed at the screen. "The left hand." A ripple of confusion swept through the room as everyone shifted their focus to the suspect's hand. Judge Kalas squinted. "What about it?" "The ring," Karia said simply. And then they saw it. On the suspect's left index finger, a silver ring gleamed under the store's dim security lights. It was a tiny detail, but it had been there all along, overlooked by everyone. A flicker of irritation crossed Riss's face, but he quickly masked it with his usual indifference. "And what does that prove?" he asked, voice cool. Karia turned to him, her gaze sharp. "I don't wear rings." The room went silent. The jury members exchanged glances, a few eyebrows raised. Even Lane, her own lawyer, shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing for the first time that his client had just turned the entire case on its head. Riss exhaled sharply, brushing it off. "A minor detail," he scoffed. "Anyone can put on a ring and take it off." But Karia wasn't done. She raised her wrist slightly, twisting it for the courtroom to see. "There's something else." She turned back to Judge Kalas. "Rewind the video a few seconds." Kalas nodded, and the footage played in reverse, stopping just before the suspect entered the store. Pause. Karia's gaze swept over the jury, then she pointed at the screen again. "The shoes." This time even Riss hesitated. "The shoes?" he repeated, feigning indifference. For the first time, Karia smirked. "They're too big." A beat of silence. People leaned forward, studying the frozen frame. "If you look closely, you'll notice that the person in the video keeps adjusting their steps, like they're struggling to walk properly. The shoes don't fit." Another ripple of whispers spread across the room. A juror nodded slowly, murmuring something to the person beside them. Lane, finally catching on, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I request a comparison between the surveillance footage and the arrest footage of my client." Riss gritted his teeth. He couldn't deny the request without making it look like he was hiding something. Kalas gave a short nod. The bailiff played the footage of Karia's arrest, and there it was. The difference was immediately clear. The shoes she wore during her arrest fit perfectly. No signs of discomfort. No awkward adjustments. A juror leaned forward, clearly reevaluating everything. Judge Kalas turned to Riss, his gaze now colder, sharper. "Prosecutor Riss, do you have an explanation for this inconsistency?" Riss's jaw tightened. For the first time, He didn't have an immediate response. Korea tilted her head, her eyes gleaming. "Funny," she said casually. "You seem to love the surveillance footage until it stopped working in your favor." A murmur spread across the courtroom. Judge Kalas leaned back, his hands clasped together. His expression shifted as if he were rethinking the entire case. Riss, visibly stiff, remained silent. The prosecution's strongest evidence, the footage, was now unraveling before their eyes. But Karaya wasn't finished yet. She had one last card to play, and this was the moment everything would change. The courtroom fell into complete silence, the air so thick with tension that it felt almost suffocating. What had once been considered irrefutable evidence was now unraveling, turning from the prosecution's strongest weapon into a double-edged sword slicing back at them. Prosecutor Riss clenched his fists on the table, his jaw tightening as frustration flickered across his face. He had entered this trial certain of victory, believing a 14-year-old girl like Korea wouldn't be able to fight back against a carefully constructed case. Yet here she was, methodically tearing it apart. She had already exposed inconsistencies, the ring on the suspect's hand, the oversized shoes, and now the faulty testimony of their key witness. And worst of all, Judge Kalas's silence. The older man had remained quiet, his expression unreadable, but there was a shift, a hesitation in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. Riss, sensing his case slipping through his fingers, grasped at the only weapon he had left. "This evidence is not enough to dismiss the witness's testimony," he declared, his voice echoing through the courtroom like a last-ditch effort to regain control. "Furthermore, we have a witness who saw the defendant at the scene." Korea remained unshaken. She knew this was his next move. She also knew it was time to end this. She turned to Judge Kalas, her voice firm. "I want to cross-examine the witness." A flicker of surprise crossed the judge's face, but after a brief pause, he nodded. "Granted. Bailiff, bring in the witness." The courtroom doors creaked open. A man in his early 50s stepped inside, thin, with graying hair and slightly trembling hands. This was Karis, an employee at Davidson & Coe Jewelry, the sole witness who claimed to have seen Karia fleeing the crime scene. He took his seat at the witness stand, eyes briefly flicking toward Riss before landing on Karia. Riss wasted no time. He stood up, adjusting his tie, his voice firm. "Mr. Karis, can you confirm that on the night of the robbery, you saw the defendant near or inside the store?" Karis hesitated. Then he nodded. "Yes, I believe so." That hesitation did not go unnoticed. Karia's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't the certainty that Riss had led everyone to believe. "Did you see me take anything?" she asked, her tone calm but piercing. Karis blinked, shifting in his seat. "No, but I saw a girl run out just as the alarm went off." "Are you certain it was me?" The pause before he answered was all she needed. Riss stiffened. Karis hesitated, then exhaled. "She looked like you." Karia tilted her head. "What color was the hoodie?" Karis frowned slightly. "Gray, I think." Silence. Then Karia turned to the jury, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "But the suspect in the surveillance video was wearing black." A ripple of whispers spread throughout the room. Riss's expression darkened. Karia wasn't done. "Mr. Karis, when you saw this person running out of the store, where were you standing?" "Behind the register," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. "Which means you only saw them as they were leaving, correct?" He nodded. "So, you never actually saw them take anything?" The room went completely still. Karis didn't answer. He couldn't. Riss sprang to his feet. "Objection! The witness is recalling from memory. Minor details don't discredit his testimony." Karia merely shrugged. Minor details can change an entire case. She turned back to the jury, her voice unwavering. This entire case is built on assumptions. No one saw me take anything. No stolen necklace was ever found on me. No fingerprints, no DNA, no actual physical evidence, just a blurry video and a witness who isn't even certain. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom. Korea locked eyes with Judge Kalas. Your Honor, if this is enough to convict me, then anyone can be convicted simply for looking like the suspect. Judge Kalas remained silent, his fingers pressing together as he leaned back in his chair. But that pause, that single moment of hesitation, was all Korea needed. She had not only defended herself, she had completely changed the direction of the trial. The courtroom was still, the weight of Karia's words pressing down like an invisible force. Every eye in the room was locked onto Judge Kalas, waiting for his next move. Karia had done what no one expected. She had dismantled the prosecution's case, piece by piece, revealing its gaping holes. A grainy surveillance video, an uncertain witness, and, most damning of all, not a single piece of physical evidence tying her to the crime. At the prosecution table, Riss clenched his jaw, struggling to maintain his composure, but the doubt in his eyes was evident. He had lost control of the narrative. Kalas slowly removed his glasses, pressing his fingers against the bridge of his nose as if he were considering a difficult decision. Then he spoke. Prosecutor Riss. His voice was measured, but there was a steel-like authority beneath it. Do you have any physical evidence linking the defendant to the stolen property? A long pause. Riss blinked, his silence stretched just a little too long. Your Honor, as I've stated, yes or no, Mr. Riss? Kalas's tone sharpened. Riss swallowed. No. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Members of the jury exchanged glances, and a few shook their heads. Korea observed them carefully. She noticed the subtle shift in their expressions. The rigid certainty they had when they first saw her in that orange jumpsuit was beginning to crack. But she wasn't finished. She turned to Riss, her voice steady. I have a question for you. He stiffened but nodded. Go ahead. Korea's next words hung in the air like a dagger. Where is the necklace? The entire room fell silent. Riss did not answer. Korea tilted her head slightly. It wasn't found on me when I was arrested. It wasn't found in my home. If I really stole it, why doesn't anyone know where it is? Riss cleared his throat, trying to regain control. The defendant could have hidden it. We don't need to find the stolen item to prove guilt. Korea let that statement settle, then raised an eyebrow. You don't need evidence? She turned, facing the jury directly. He's asking you to convict me with no physical proof, no fingerprints, no stolen item, no reliable witness. Just a blurry video and a vague claim that I look like the suspect. She scanned each juror's face, letting the weight of her words sink in. If one day someone accused you of being near a crime scene, if there was a blurry video of someone who looks like you, but no evidence, no stolen item, no real proof, would you want to be convicted on maybe? A heavy silence filled the room. For the first time since the trial began, Korea saw doubt in the jurors' eyes. Kalas turned to Riss. Do you have anything to refute this? Riss pressed his lips into a thin line. He had nothing, but he refused to accept defeat so easily. Your Honor, with all due respect, Riss said, turning back to the jury, just because the defendant is articulate and understands legal principles does not change the fact that she is the prime suspect in this case. She was near the scene. A witness saw someone resembling her, and the video places her at the store before the crime. Karia took a slow breath. This was his last stand, convincing the jury that even with no proof, they should convict her anyway. She was ready. "Then let's talk about that," she said, her voice calm and controlled. She turned to the jury, looking them in the eye. "You say I know the law like it's a bad thing, but isn't it the court's duty to ensure innocent people aren't wrongfully convicted?" Her gaze hardened. "Today, it's me. But if this system can convict someone like me without evidence, who's next?" A chill ran through the courtroom. Judge Kalas exhaled deeply, removing his glasses once more. His fingers drummed against his desk as he glanced at the jury. Then finally, he spoke. "I believe we've heard enough." The gavel struck the bench, signaling the start of jury deliberations. Karia lowered herself back into her seat, her expression unreadable. She didn't know if they would find her innocent or guilty, but she knew one thing. They were questioning everything now. And in this courtroom, asking the right questions was the first step toward finding the truth. The jury filed out of the courtroom, leaving behind a suffocating silence that seemed to stretch infinitely. No one spoke. No one moved. Every breath was held in anticipation, as if the very walls of the courtroom were waiting for the verdict to return. Karia sat still, her gaze fixed on the closed door through which the jury deliberated. But she did not fidget. She did not shift in her seat. If this trial had taught her anything, it was that patience could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Across the room, Prosecutor Riss stood with his arms crossed, his glare fixed downward at the papers before him, papers that now felt utterly meaningless. He knew he was losing. He just hadn't accepted it yet. Judge Kalas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if processing the weight of everything that had unfolded. Karia had not only defended herself, she had forced the entire courtroom to reconsider what justice really meant. The silence dragged on. Court officials exchanged glances. Spectators whispered among themselves. But every eye remained on the door where the jury deliberated. And then it opened. Everyone in the room straightened at once, all eyes on the jury foreperson, a piece of paper in his hand. Judge Kalas nodded, his voice level. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson stepped forward, his voice calm yet weighty. "On the charges of theft and destruction of property, we find the defendant not guilty." The room erupted. Gasps filled the air. Some murmured in disbelief, others exchanged wide-eyed glances. A few lowered their heads, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Across the room, Riss clenched his jaw so tightly it looked painful. His eyes shut for a moment, as if trying to block out reality itself. But Karia? She did not react immediately. She let the words sink in, let them settle deep into her bones. She had won. She had proven the system could be wrong, that a 14-year-old girl could stand up and fight when no one else would. Judge Kalas struck his gavel against the bench. The defendant is free to go. The metallic click of unfastening handcuffs echoed in her ears. Her wrists felt light as the cold metal restraints slipped away. Slowly, she rose to her feet. Her eyes swept over the courtroom, taking in every face. And then her gaze met Riss's. He stared at her, his loss etched clearly on his face. But he did not look away. He did not admit defeat. This was not a battle he would easily forget. But Karia? She didn't need to say a word. The truth had already spoken for her. With measured steps, she turned away and walked down the aisle. Each footstep echoed like a declaration of the freedom she had reclaimed. And then she saw him, Frank. Her grandfather sat near the exit, his expression unreadable. But in his eyes, Karia saw something she had never seen before: pride. She exhaled deeply, stepping out of the courthouse. The air outside was different, lighter, freer. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. Because today, she had defended herself, but tomorrow, she might have to defend someone else. The courtroom doors closed behind Karia, but the echoes of the trial still lingered in her mind. The defendant is free to go. Those words had changed everything, but not everyone was happy with the outcome. Inside the courtroom, Riss stood rigid, his hands clenched against the table, his jaw locked tight. He had lost, not because of a lack of skill, but because the truth had not been on his side. Karia had done more than just prove her innocence. She had forced the entire system to question the way it handed down its judgments. But this victory had not come from luck. She had fought for it. She had stood up, defended herself, and, more importantly, made people listen. Outside the courthouse, the sky stretched wide and blue, the air far lighter than the suffocating atmosphere inside. Frank stood waiting, his eyes thoughtful but filled with pride. Karia walked toward him, but before she could speak, he did first. "You did well." She swallowed hard, a strange sense of relief settling in her chest. "I shouldn't have had to." Her voice was laced with exhaustion. Frank nodded slowly. "No, you shouldn't have, but that doesn't change the fact that you did." Karia turned, her gaze drifting toward the people filtering out of the courthouse. Some barely glanced at her, indifferent. Others seemed to be deep in thought, processing what they had just witnessed. But she no longer cared about their stares. She had proven something important, that the system wasn't always right, and that if no one asked questions, injustice would continue unchecked. Frank sighed, his voice lowering. "Did you learn anything from all of this?" Karia smirked, a wry amusement flickering across her lips. "That if I don't defend myself, no one else will?" Frank chuckled lightly. "Close." He placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his gaze turning serious. "You didn't just protect yourself, Karia. You taught that entire courtroom a lesson about justice, and not everyone gets the chance to do that." She took a deep breath. Maybe he was right. She had entered the courthouse as a defendant, but she had walked out as something else entirely. Someone who understood the flaws of the system, and someone who knew how to fight back when it failed. And this was only the beginning. The air outside the courthouse felt fresher, but Karia knew the freedom she had just reclaimed didn't come from the system's mercy. It came from her own sharp reasoning and ability to defend herself against a system that was never built in her favor. Frank stood beside her, his expression thoughtful. He had remained silent throughout the trial, but now his voice was deep and steady. "You did something most people never get the chance to do. You made them think." Karia smirked, but her emotions were still tangled. She had won, but at what cost? She glanced back at the courthouse doors. Riss was still standing there, his face rigid, his eyes dark with the weight of a defeat he never expected. She had done something he never saw coming. Not just proving her innocence, but forcing the entire system to question its own process. "I won, but how many people out there can't do the same?" Karia whispered. Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly before saying, "Most of them." That answer was heavier than anything Karia had heard before. She had almost been convicted based on a grainy video, an uncertain witness, and no physical evidence. If she hadn't known the law, if she hadn't been strong enough to fight back, she would have lost. Not because she was guilty, but because the system had already decided she was. So what now? She turned to her grandfather, her gaze steady. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Frank looked at her for a long moment before a small smile formed on his lips. "That's up to you, Karia, but if you can defend yourself, you can defend others." His words echoed in her mind. Defend others. She looked back at the courthouse. The place where, just hours ago, everyone was certain she was guilty, but they were wrong. And how many others never got the chance to prove the same? She didn't know exactly what her next step was, but one thing was certain. Her story wouldn't end here, because if a 14-year-old girl could take on a system that was built to work against her, who knew what else she was capable of? The air outside the courthouse felt lighter, but Karia's heart was still heavy. She had won, not because the system worked the way it was supposed to, but because she had fought against it herself. Frank stood beside her, his eyes filled with pride. But there was something else there too, a quiet sorrow. He looked at Karia, then back toward the courthouse doors, where Riss still stood, his face stiff with defeat. She hadn't just dismantled this case, she had made them question everything, but had they actually learned anything? Karia turned to her grandfather, her voice quieter. Do you think they really understand? Frank took a deep breath, then shrugged slightly. Some will, some won't. One trial doesn't change the system. His answer made her pause. She had walked into that courtroom as a defendant, a case file, a statistic. She had sat there in that orange jumpsuit, shoulders weighed down by judgmental stares. But she walked out with an undeniable truth. She wasn't just a defendant. She was someone who knew how to fight. But what about the people who never got that chance? She thought about the other kids, the ones who didn't know their rights, who had no one to stand up for them. Today, she had escaped a wrongful conviction, but how many others hadn't? She turned back to look at the courthouse again, but this time her gaze was different. This wasn't just the place that had tried to condemn her. It was also the place where she had made them listen. And if she could do it once, she could do it again. She could help others do the same. Frank watched her for a long moment before chuckling softly. What's on your mind, kid? Karia took a deep breath, then smiled slightly. I think I learned something important today. And what's that? She looked up at him, her eyes burning with a determination she had never felt before. If the system won't change, then I will. A gentle breeze swept across the courthouse steps, but Karia remained still, staring at the heavy wooden doors she had just walked through. Inside that building, she had fought for her freedom, and won, but she couldn't stop thinking about the others, the ones who never got that chance. Frank stood beside her, hands tucked into his coat pockets, his face as contemplative as ever. He didn't need to say anything. Karia knew he was waiting for her to reach her own conclusion. And she had. She had walked into that courtroom as a defendant, but she walked out with an entirely new understanding. She had won, but not because the system was fair. She won because she had realized that the system could be wrong, and she couldn't stop thinking about that. Karia let out a slow breath, her eyes still fixed on the courthouse. They could do this to anyone, couldn't they? Frank didn't answer right away. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. Yeah, kid, they could. She frowned, pressing her lips together. What about the people who don't know how to fight back? Frank inhaled deeply, then exhaled just as slowly. They lose. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of 1,000 injustices. Karia had been lucky to know how to question things, lucky to spot the flaws in the prosecution's case, lucky to understand the law. But what about the ones who had no one to stand up for them? She had spent the entire trial defending herself. And now she found herself wondering, who was defending everyone else? That's not fair, she whispered. Frank let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Fairness isn't what this system cares about, kid. She turned to look at him, a new fire burning in her eyes. But if the system doesn't care, then who will? Frank paused, then shrugged. People like you. Karia didn't say anything, but something inside her shifted. This couldn't just be her story anymore. She had won. But if others were still losing, then what did her victory really mean? She didn't know exactly what she was going to do next. But she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The late afternoon sky was painted in hues of orange and gold, with the setting sun casting a soft glow over the courthouse steps. Karia stood there, feeling the breeze brush against her skin, but her mind was still trapped inside the courtroom, where she had just fought for herself and won. Frank stood beside her, his wise eyes watching the people exiting the courthouse. Some hurried away, others glanced at her with uncertainty, perhaps still unable to grasp the fact that a 14-year-old girl had just defeated the system. But Karia didn't care about their stares. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, not just to her, but to others, the ones who didn't know how to fight back, the ones who had no one to stand beside them. She turned to her grandfather, her voice low. "I won." Frank nodded. "You did. But how many others have lost because they never had the chance to prove the truth?" Frank was silent for a moment, then he spoke, his voice heavy yet honest. "Too many." Karia swallowed hard. She had almost been convicted because of a blurry video, an uncertain witness, and a system that wasn't built to seek the truth, but rather to take the easy way out. And it would keep happening, unless someone stood up to change it. Frank studied her for a long moment, then a small smile crossed his face. "What are you thinking, kid?" Karia took a slow, deep breath, then exhaled. "I'm thinking, if I can save myself, then I can save others too." Her grandfather let out a quiet chuckle, but there was something proud in his eyes. "Do you have a plan?" Karia smiled softly, but deep down, she already knew the answer. "Not yet. But I know I can't let this end here." She turned and started down the courthouse steps. With each step, her resolve grew stronger, because this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Karia's story isn't just about a trial. It's about the deep flaws within the justice system. She walked into that courtroom as a defendant, but she left with a newfound understanding. Justice doesn't come to you. You have to fight for it. Had she not known her rights, had she not dared to question authority, she might have been just another statistic, another wrongful conviction buried in the system. This system is far from perfect, and too many people never get the chance to defend themselves. But Karia proved that knowledge is the most powerful weapon of all, and that the truth will never stay buried as long as there's someone willing to fight for it. The lesson from her story isn't just about standing up for yourself, it's about responsibility. Once you recognize injustice, you can't ignore it. So learn, question, and most importantly, never let anyone decide your fate except you. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.